The flashing red and blue lights cut through the dark streets like warning flares, reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. Karen Blackwood gripped the steering wheel of her car, her heart steady, but her mind racing. She hadn't broken any laws. She wasn't speeding. And yet, the cruiser behind her blared its siren, demanding her to pull over. As she parked at the curb and watched two officers approach her car, their expressions rigid with authority, Karen knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about assumptions, bias, and power. What the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that they were walking straight into a reckoning with the very woman who outranked them all. This was the moment when lines blurred, and the weight of systemic prejudice collided with the unwavering resolve of a leader who had spent her entire life fighting for change. Before we dive deeper into Karen Blackwood's gripping story of leadership, defiance, and transformation, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And if this tale resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire. The late afternoon sun bathed the city in golden hues as Karen Blackwood adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the light fading into twilight. The day had been long, filled with meetings, decisions, and responsibilities that came with her new role as chief of police. For Karen, this wasn't just another job. It was a historic milestone. She was the first Black woman to ever hold the position in a precinct with a long and contentious history of racial tensions. Karen knew her appointment symbolized something far greater than personal achievement. It represented the aspirations of countless people who had long hoped for change. However, she wasn't naive. Symbolism could only take her so far. The real work lay ahead, and it would be a battle against not just the system, but also the ingrained attitudes of many of her officers in the community they were supposed to serve. Her thoughts drifted to her father, a civil rights activist whose unwavering commitment to justice had shaped her from an early age. She remembered how he would come home, exhausted but still filled with a fire to make the world better for future generations. He taught her that change wasn't about grand gestures, but about small, steady steps, each one a crack in the foundation of an unjust system. That belief had driven Karen her entire life. Karen's journey to becoming chief of police hadn't been easy. Growing up in a predominantly working-class Black neighborhood, she had always felt the tension between her community and law enforcement. Police cars cruising slowly through her streets seemed less like a sign of safety and more like a looming threat. As a young girl, she often heard stories from friends and family about being stopped, questioned, or harassed for no reason other than their skin color. Despite this, Karen saw policing as a tool for justice. If the system is broken, her father used to say, you either fix it from within or tear it down from the outside. Karen chose the former. She enrolled in the police academy, knowing she would be one of the few women, and even fewer Black women, taking that path. Her early days as an officer weren't easy. Colleagues underestimated her, supervisors overlooked her, and some outright dismissed her presence as a temporary distraction. But Karen wasn't one to back down. With grit, intelligence, and a sharp sense of justice, she climbed the ranks, first as a rookie officer, then a detective, and finally into leadership roles. Each step was a battle, but each victory reinforced her belief that she belonged in spaces where she was often told she didn't. Now, a month into her new position as chief, Karen was adjusting to the weight of her title. Her precinct was one of the toughest in the city, plagued by accusations of corruption, racial profiling, and broken relationships with the community. Karen had accepted the job knowing it would put her directly in the line of fire. But she also believed that it was exactly where she needed to be. As she drove home through the streets she had grown up on, Karen felt the familiar mix of pride and pressure. She recognized every turn, every faded mural, and every shop that had managed to survive decades of economic hardship. These streets held her memories, both bitter and sweet. They were her roots, and now they were her responsibility. Suddenly, the shrill wail of a siren pulled her out of her thoughts. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, illuminating the darkening streets. A police cruiser was tailing her, its siren demanding her attention. Karen furrowed her brow, confused. She checked her speedometer, which was well within the limit, and scanned the area. There was no apparent reason for her to be stopped. With a sigh, she signaled and pulled over to the curb. Her heart remained steady, but her mind raced. Why was she being stopped? She wasn't dressed in her uniform, and her unassuming sedan didn't have the markings of an official vehicle. To the officers behind her, she likely looked like just another woman driving home through the wrong part of town. The cruiser came to a stop behind her, and Karen watched through her side mirror as two officers emerged. They moved deliberately, their postures radiating authority. The taller officer, Davis, approached her window, while the shorter one, Grant, hung back, his arms crossed as he surveyed the surroundings. Karen rolled down her window, her expression calm. She had encountered this situation countless times before, not as a suspect but as someone who understood all too well the dynamics of power and bias at play. "License and registration, ma'am," Davis said. His tone was firm, clipped, and carried the faint undertone of dismissal. Karen handed him her documents without a word, her silence measured. She could already sense where this was going. "What brings you to this part of town?" Davis asked after a cursory glance at her license. His question wasn't about curiosity. It was about authority. "I live around here," Karen replied evenly. Her words were simple, but she knew their weight. She could feel the unspoken judgment in Davis's tone, as though her presence in this neighborhood was something that required justification. Grant stepped closer, his voice quieter but no less probing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Care to tell us what you're doing here at this time?" Karen's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, though her expression remained neutral. She had heard this script before. The vague accusations, the condescending tone, the insinuation that her presence was inherently suspicious, and the pattern of the badge itself were as old as the badge itself. She could have shut the entire situation down by revealing her identity as their superior. A single flash of her badge, and the entire charade would crumble. But Karen decided to wait. Years of experience had taught her to choose her battles carefully, and this was one she wanted to see play out a little longer. "I'm on my way home," Karen said, her voice steady but offering no more details than necessary. She didn't owe them an explanation, and she wasn't about to offer one. Davis's expression hardened. He leaned closer, his face now inches from hers. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone carrying a note of irritation. Karen paused. This was the moment. She had a choice: comply and let the scene continue, or assert herself and reveal the truth. Her gaze met Davis's, unwavering. "Officer," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Do you know who I am?" Davis froze, confusion flashing across his face. He exchanged a glance with Grant, the unspoken question hanging between them. "Should I?" Davis finally asked, his bravado faltering. Karen allowed a faint smile to cross her lips, one devoid of amusement. "Let's just say you'll want to reconsider how you proceed from here." The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Davis straightened, suddenly unsure of himself. For a moment, silence enveloped them, the weight of Karen's words settling like a stone. Bookmark. And in that moment, Karen knew she held the upper hand. The silence that followed Karen Blackwood's declaration was thick, almost suffocating. Officers Davis and Grant exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence faltering. They weren't used to being questioned, least of all by someone they had assumed was just another civilian. "Well," Davis started, trying to recover, "if you're someone we should know, maybe you ought to explain yourself." His tone was still firm, but there was a noticeable crack in his bravado. Karen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, letting the weight of the moment stretch out. Years of experience had taught her that silence, when used correctly, could be more commanding than words. And in this moment, she wanted these two officers to feel the full gravity of their actions. "Officer Davis," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with steel, "I am Karen Blackwood, the chief of police for this precinct." The words landed like a thunderclap. Davis blinked, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no sound came out. Behind him, Grant's posture stiffened, his arms dropping to his sides as the realization dawned. "Chief?" Davis stammered, his face a mix of disbelief and panic. You're the new chief?" "That's correct," Karen said, her tone unwavering. and I'd like to know why 2 of my officers are pulling over a law-abiding citizen without cause." Davis straightened, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Chief, we didn't know. We thought." He trailed off, fumbling for an explanation that didn't sound incriminating. Karen's gaze didn't waver. "You thought what? That I didn't belong here? That I must be doing something suspicious simply because I'm driving through this neighborhood?" "Ma'am, we were just following protocol," Grant interjected, his voice quieter but no less defensive. "There've been reports." "Save it," Karen interrupted, her tone sharp. "I know exactly what this is. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." The officers fell silent, their earlier confidence now completely shattered. Karen could see the gears turning in their minds, the realization sinking in that this was no routine stop. They hadn't just pulled over a random driver. They had stopped the one person in the department who could hold them accountable. Karen opened her car door and stepped out, the quiet authority in her movements commanding their full attention. Standing before the 2 officers, she fixed them with a steady gaze. "Do you have any idea how damaging this is?" she asked, her voice steady but laden with disappointment. "Not just to me, but to this department and the community we're supposed to serve?" Davis swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Chief, it wasn't personal. It's always personal," Karen cut in, her voice rising slightly. "Every time you profile someone based on the color of their skin or the way they look, it's personal. And it's not just about this one traffic stop. It's about every person in this city who's been treated the same way and walked away feeling less safe, less respected, and less human because of it." Grant lowered his gaze, his face a mask of guilt. Davis, on the other hand, seemed to struggle with the weight of her words. Karen could see the defensiveness creeping back into his expression, the instinct to justify his actions rather than reflect on them. "Look," Davis said, his tone more subdued now, "we were just doing our jobs. It wasn't about—" Karen held up a hand, silencing him. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "If this is your idea of doing your job, then you're in the wrong line of work." The 2 officers said nothing, their discomfort palpable. Karen took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "This department has a history," she continued. "A long, ugly history of profiling and mistreating people of color in this city. I grew up here. I've lived that reality. And now, as your chief, I'm here to make sure it stops." Davis and Grant nodded stiffly, their silence speaking volumes. Karen could see the shame in their faces, but shame wasn't enough. She needed accountability, and she needed them to understand that their actions had consequences. "This incident won't be swept under the rug," Karen said firmly. "I'll be reviewing your conduct, and there will be repercussions. Do you understand?" "Yes, Chief," they mumbled in unison, their voices barely audible. Karen exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She hadn't expected to face such a blatant display of bias so soon into her tenure, but perhaps she should have. Change was never easy, and the resistance to it often manifested in moments like these, small acts of defiance that revealed the deeper rot within the system. "Return to your vehicle," she ordered. "I'll see you both in my office first thing tomorrow morning." The 2 officers nodded and retreated to their cruiser, their steps hurried and awkward. Karen watched them drive away, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. She stood there for a moment, the cool evening air brushing against her skin as she processed what had just happened. This was more than a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It was a stark reminder of the challenges she faced as chief. The culture of her department needed a complete overhaul, and incidents like this only underscored how urgent that work was. Karen got back into her car and resumed her drive home, her mind racing. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, both from within the department and from those who benefited from the status quo. But Karen wasn't one to back down from a fight. If anything, this incident had only strengthened her resolve. As she pulled into her driveway, the faint glow of her porch light welcomed her home. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to let the tension of the evening melt away. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, and new opportunities to push for the change she believed in. Karen Blackwood had chosen this path, knowing it would be hard. But she also knew that nothing worth fighting for ever came easy. The next morning, Karen Blackwood arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. The city was still quiet, its streets bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. But inside Karen's mind, there was no calm. Last night's traffic stop replayed over and over as she climbed the precinct steps, each one a reminder of how much work lay ahead. By the time she reached her office, word of the incident had already spread through the department like wildfire. As Karen walked down the hallway, she could feel the weight of her officers' stares. Some avoided her gaze entirely, while others offered stiff, awkward nods. She could tell they were curious, uneasy, and above all, watching to see what she would do next. Karen's first order of business was addressing Officers Davis and Grant. She summoned them to her office and laid down the law. Their actions were not only unacceptable, but emblematic of a deeper issue within the department. They tried to explain themselves, offering half-hearted excuses about following procedure and doing their job. But Karen wasn't interested in excuses. By the end of the meeting, both officers left with a clear understanding. Their behavior wouldn't be tolerated, and they were on thin ice. But Karen knew that dealing with Davis and Grant was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in addressing the broader culture of her department and the community they were supposed to serve. The ripple effects of the traffic stop weren't confined to the precinct walls. By mid-morning, news of the incident had reached the streets, fueled by whispers, text messages, and social media posts. The community, already distrustful of law enforcement, seized on the story as another example of police overreach. To them, Karen's appointment as chief had been a beacon of hope, a sign that things might finally change. But last night's events were a stark reminder of how deep the scars ran. By the afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the precinct. They held signs bearing slogans like "No Justice, No Peace" and "Stop the Profiling." Their chants echoed through the streets, a mix of anger and exhaustion. These weren't just protesters, they were residents, parents, workers, and students who had grown tired of feeling like outsiders in their own neighborhoods. Karen watched the scene unfold from her office window. The faces in the crowd were familiar, their frustration palpable. She understood their anger. She shared it. But now, as chief, she had to walk a fine line. She needed to rebuild trust with the community, while also holding her officers accountable. It was a balancing act that few had managed to pull off. But Karen was determined to try. "Chief Blackwood?" a voice called from the door. Karen turned to see Lieutenant Teresa Martinez standing there, a clipboard in hand. Teresa was one of the few people Karen trusted implicitly. A seasoned officer with decades of experience, Teresa was as sharp as she was compassionate. She understood the nuances of leadership and the challenges of being a woman of color in a male-dominated field. "I just spoke with some of the organizers outside," Teresa said. "They're asking to meet with you." Karen nodded, already expecting this. "Who's leading the group?" "Alicia Roberts," Teresa replied. "She's been a vocal critic of the department for years. She's smart, passionate, and if I'm being honest, doesn't trust us one bit." Karen allowed herself a faint smile. "Can you blame her?" Teresa shook her head. "Not at all." Later that afternoon, Karen stepped out of the precinct and approached the crowd. The chants quieted as people noticed her presence. Karen's reputation had preceded her. Many in the community saw her as one of their own, but they were wary of placing too much faith in someone who now wore a badge. Karen raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "Alicia Roberts?" she called out, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Alicia stepped forward. She was tall, with natural curls and a piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through people. Karen had met her briefly during a community forum weeks earlier, but this was their first face-to-face confrontation. "I'm Chief Blackwood," Karen began, extending her hand. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Alicia didn't immediately take the handshake. Her arms were crossed, her expression guarded. "I hope you're here to listen," she said, her tone sharp. "Because people around here are done with excuses." Karen lowered her hand, unfazed by Alicia's demeanor. "I'm here to listen," she said simply. "And I'm here to make sure what happened last night doesn't happen again." "Is that so?" Alicia countered. "Because we've been hearing that for years. Promises, apologies, more promises. Meanwhile, your officers are out here stopping, frisking, and intimidating our young men for no reason. Karen nodded, her expression serious. You're right. What happened last night was unacceptable, and I'm addressing it. But this goes deeper than one incident, and we both know it. The only way forward is to fix the system, not just patch the cracks. Alicia studied Karen for a moment, her sharp gaze softening slightly. So what are you proposing? She asked, her tone still cautious. Karen gestured toward the precinct. Let's sit down and talk. You, me, and whoever else you want to bring to the table. We need to have a real conversation about how to rebuild trust, not just with you, but with the entire community. For a moment, Alicia hesitated. The tension between them was thick, a reflection of the long, painful history that had brought them to this point. But finally, she nodded. Tomorrow, Alicia said. Noon. And you'd better come prepared, Chief, because people around here are tired of empty words. Karen extended her hand again, and this time, Alicia took it. The handshake was firm, a cautious truce between two women who both wanted change, even if they didn't yet trust each other. As the crowd dispersed, Karen returned to her office, her mind already racing with ideas for the meeting. She knew this was her chance to start mending the fractured relationship between her department and the community. It wouldn't be easy. Trust wasn't built overnight, but Karen was willing to put in the work. That night, she stayed at the precinct late, poring over reports, complaints, and past attempts at reform. Each document was a reminder of the systemic dysfunction she had inherited, but it also fueled her determination. This wasn't just a job for Karen, it was a mission. When she finally left for the night, the streets were quiet again. The porch lights of the neighborhood glowed softly, a reminder that while the day's battles were over, tomorrow would bring new challenges. Karen Blackwood had chosen this fight, and she wasn't about to back down. The morning of the community meeting arrived, but Karen Blackwood's focus was already divided. As she prepared for her critical discussion with Alicia Roberts and other community leaders, another storm was brewing within her department. Rumblings of discontent had grown louder since the traffic stop incident, and Karen knew she couldn't ignore it much longer. It started with whispers in the break room and sideways glances in the hallways. Some officers resented the changes Karen was implementing, viewing them as an affront to the way things had always been done. Among the discontented voices, one name kept surfacing: Sergeant Jeff Parker. A veteran officer with over 20 years on the force, Jeff had a reputation for being both respected and feared among his peers. He was the kind of officer who believed in old-school policing, firm authority, little room for nuance, and an unshakable loyalty to his own kind. Karen had clashed with Jeff before, though always indirectly. He was the first to question her policies during meetings, the first to grumble about the mandatory bias training she'd introduced, and the loudest voice criticizing her focus on community relations. Still, Karen had tolerated him, knowing that outright confrontation would only galvanize his supporters. But that tolerance had its limits. Bookmark. Go back. As Karen arrived at her office that morning, she found Lieutenant Teresa Martinez waiting for her, holding a thin folder. Teresa's face was unreadable, but Karen could sense the tension. What is it? Karen asked, closing the door behind her. Teresa hesitated before handing over the folder. I've been looking into the morale issue you asked me about. It's worse than we thought. Karen opened the folder, scanning the pages. Inside were notes on private meetings, anonymous complaints, and off-the-record comments from officers. What stood out most were the repeated references to Jeff Parker. He's organizing, isn't he? Karen said, her tone flat but sharp. Teresa nodded grimly. Not officially, but yes. He's meeting with a group of officers after hours, mostly the older guys, the ones who've been here the longest. They're calling you a disruptor, saying you don't understand what this department really needs. Karen let out a slow breath, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Do they think I'm here for a popularity contest? This isn't about me being liked. It's about doing what's right. It's more than that, Teresa said carefully. They don't just dislike you. They're actively working against you. I've heard talk of them dragging their feet on new protocols, ignoring directives, and undermining your authority wherever they can. Karen closed the folder, her jaw tightening. She had expected resistance, But this level of organized defiance was a dangerous escalation. "What's their endgame?" Karen asked. Teresa hesitated, then said, "Some of them think they can push you out. If they make your job hard enough, they figure you'll quit, or the mayor will lose confidence in you." Karen leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Quitting had never been an option for her, but the thought of a faction within her own department working to sabotage her was a bitter pill to swallow. Later that day, as Karen prepared for the community meeting, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Officer Ramirez, one of the younger patrol officers who had quietly aligned himself with her vision for change. Karen respected Ramirez for his willingness to adapt, even when it wasn't easy. The message was short. "Chief, we've got a problem. Found this on my desk this morning." Attached was a photo of a note, scrawled in bold, angry handwriting. "Traitors don't belong here. Watch your back." Karen stared at the message, her stomach tightening. Threats like this weren't new to her. She'd faced plenty of them during her career, but knowing they came from someone within her department added a layer of personal betrayal. Whoever left the note wasn't just resisting her leadership. They were trying to intimidate her into leaving. Karen picked up the phone and called Ramirez. "Where's the note now?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "I kept it in my locker," Ramirez replied nervously. "I didn't want to make a big deal without telling you first." "You did the right thing," Karen assured him. "Keep this quiet for now. I'll handle it." After hanging up, Karen sat back in her chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't naive. She knew change wouldn't come without resistance. But this wasn't just pushback. It was a coordinated effort to destabilize her leadership. And if she didn't address it soon, it could spiral out of control. By the time Karen walked into the conference room for the community meeting, her mind was a storm of competing priorities. But she pushed the unrest within her department aside, focusing on the task at hand. Alicia Roberts and her team were already seated at the long table, their expressions a mix of skepticism and cautious hope. "Thank you for coming," Karen said as she took her seat. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult, and I want to acknowledge the pain and frustration many of you are feeling. But I'm here because I believe we can find a path forward together." Alicia leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Karen. "We've heard that before, Chief. What makes this time different?" Karen met Alicia's gaze without flinching. "Because this time, I'm not just making promises. I'm taking action. Starting with mandatory bias training for every officer in this department, from top to bottom, no exceptions." The young activist Malik, seated next to Alicia, folded his arms. "Training is great, but what about accountability? What happens when your officers keep doing what they've always done?" Karen nodded, anticipating the question. "We're establishing a community oversight board," she said. "This board will have real authority, not just to review complaints, but to recommend disciplinary actions and ensure transparency in how we handle misconduct." A murmur spread through the room. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "And who's on this board? More cops?" "No," Karen said firmly. "It will be made up of residents from this community, people like you. I want this board to be a bridge between us, not a rubber stamp." The tension in the room eased slightly, though skepticism remained. Karen knew this was just the beginning of a long road. Rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight, but she was determined to earn it. After the meeting, Karen returned to her office, her energy drained but her resolve stronger than ever. She knew the battle for change wasn't just being fought outside the precinct, it was raging within its very walls. And while she had made progress with the community, the fight to bring her department in line with her vision was far from over. Karen opened her desk drawer and took out the folder Teresa had given her that morning. Inside, she saw the names of officers who had been attending Jeff Parker's secret meetings, their loyalty to the old ways outweighing their duty to serve and protect. If Jeff and his faction thought she would back down, they were mistaken. Karen wasn't just fighting for her job, she was fighting for the future of her precinct and the community she had sworn to protect. The real battle was just beginning. Karen Blackwood was no stranger to conflict, but the note left on Officer Ramirez's desk took the situation to a dangerous new level. The threat wasn't just about challenging her leadership, it was personal. and a line crossed that demanded a response. Karen wasn't intimidated, but she understood the stakes. If she allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked, it would embolden those who sought to undermine her. Sitting at her desk that evening, Karen stared at the note Ramirez had brought her. The jagged handwriting and aggressive tone weren't just the marks of frustration. They were a declaration of war from within her own department. Karen folded the note carefully and placed it in a secure drawer. She would address this, but not before she had all the facts. The next morning, Karen called Lieutenant Teresa Martinez into her office. Teresa, always calm and composed, stepped inside with a folder of reports tucked under her arm. Her sharp eyes took in Karen's expression immediately. "You've seen the note," Teresa said, not as a question but as a statement. Karen nodded. "It's more than just idle talk, Teresa. This is deliberate, organized." Teresa sat down across from Karen, placing the folder on the desk. "I've been digging into this for weeks, and it's worse than I thought. Jeff Parker isn't just grumbling in the break room. He's rallying his supporters, and they're using every excuse to resist your changes, delaying paperwork, refusing to implement protocols, even influencing younger officers to question your authority." Karen leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "How widespread is it?" Teresa sighed. "It's hard to say. Most of the senior officers are loyal to Jeff, but there's a middle group, officers who aren't fully on his side but are afraid to speak out. They don't want to risk their careers." Karen's jaw tightened. She understood fear. She'd faced plenty of it herself during her rise through the ranks, but fear couldn't be allowed to paralyze progress. "We need to isolate Jeff," Karen said. "Cut off his influence before he gets any stronger." "That's easier said than done," Teresa replied. "Jeff's been here for over 20 years. He knows this department inside and out, and he has connections all the way to City Hall. If we're going after him, we have to be strategic." Karen nodded, her mind already formulating a plan. "Start by identifying the officers who are still on the fence. If we can bring them to our side, it'll weaken Jeff's position. And keep digging quietly. I want to know exactly who's involved in this." Teresa gave a sharp nod. "Understood." That afternoon, as Karen walked through the precinct, she couldn't ignore the tension in the air. Conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Officers avoided her gaze or offered forced smiles. The undercurrent of hostility was palpable, but Karen refused to let it rattle her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. As she passed the squad room, she spotted Jeff Parker leaning against a desk, surrounded by a group of officers. He was laughing, his booming voice filling the room, but his eyes flicked to Karen the moment she entered. The brief pause in his demeanor was enough to tell her he knew she was watching. Karen stopped in her tracks, locking eyes with Jeff. The room grew silent as the officers around him straightened, their postures shifting from casual to tense. For a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Then, without a word, Karen continued walking, her steps steady and deliberate. The message was clear. She wasn't afraid of him. That evening, Karen stayed late at the precinct, reviewing reports and planning her next move. The more she uncovered about Jeff's network, the more determined she became to root out the toxicity in her department. But as the hours stretched on, fatigue began to set in. Just as she was about to pack up for the night, her phone buzzed. It was Teresa. "You need to see this," Teresa said, her voice tense. "Come to the squad room, now." Karen's pulse quickened as she made her way down the dimly lit hallway. When she entered the squad room, Teresa was standing near a cluster of desks with Officer Ramirez. On one of the desks was a small envelope, its flap unsealed. Teresa handed it to Karen without a word. Karen opened the envelope and pulled out another note. The message was short but chilling. "We're watching you. Leave while you still can." Karen's face remained unreadable as she folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. She turned to Teresa and Ramirez, her voice calm but firm. "Nobody else knows about this, correct?" Ramirez shook his head. "No, Chief. I found it when I got back from patrol and went straight to Lieutenant Martinez." "Good," Karen said. "This stays between us for now, but whoever left this note wants us to react. We won't give them the satisfaction." Teresa stepped closer, her expression serious. "Karen, this is escalating. Whoever's doing this isn't just trying to intimidate you, they're testing you." Karen nodded slowly. And I intend to pass their test. The next day, Karen called a meeting with her senior staff. She stood at the head of the long conference table, her presence commanding the room. Around her sat a mix of loyal supporters, cautious observers, and thinly veiled skeptics. Jeff Parker was among them, his arms crossed as he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Let me make something very clear," Karen began, her voice steady but firm. "This department is at a crossroads. We can either continue with the same practices that have alienated our community and tarnished our reputation, or we can choose a new path, one that prioritizes accountability, integrity, and trust." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I know not everyone in this room agrees with my vision for change, and that's fine. But let me be perfectly clear, this is not a democracy. I was appointed chief of police to lead this department, and I intend to do just that." Jeff shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Karen's gaze flicked to him briefly before sweeping over the rest of the room. "If anyone here feels they can't support this direction," Karen continued, her tone hardening, "you're free to leave. But know this, resistance won't be tolerated. We are here to serve our community, not ourselves. If you can't align with that mission, you have no place in this department." The room was silent, the weight of Karen's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Even Jeff didn't speak, though his expression betrayed his simmering anger. Karen leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "This isn't just about me, it's about the future of this department. And let me be clear, I will do whatever it takes to ensure that future is one we can all be proud of." As the meeting adjourned, Karen watched the officers file out, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and begrudging respect. Jeff lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Karen's in a silent challenge before he turned and left. Karen exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The battle was far from over, but she had drawn her line in the sand. Now it was up to her department to decide which side of it they stood on. The next few days passed in a tense, uneasy quiet. Karen Blackwood had drawn her line in the sand, and now she was waiting to see who would cross it. Her confrontation during the senior staff meeting had sent a clear message, but Karen knew Jeff Parker wasn't the type to back down easily. He was cunning, experienced, and deeply entrenched in the department's old ways of thinking. For him, Karen's leadership wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to everything he believed policing should be. Late one afternoon, Teresa Martinez stepped into Karen's office, her expression grim. She placed a stack of reports on Karen's desk and crossed her arms. "We've got a problem," Teresa said, her voice low. "Jeff's making his move." Karen leaned forward, her focus sharpening. "What do you mean?" "He's rallying his group," Teresa explained. "They're not just grumbling anymore. They're outright refusing to follow new directives. Delayed responses to community calls, skipping the bias training, ignoring the new protocols you put in place. It's deliberate, Karen. They're trying to send a message." Karen exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her desk. "And the rest of the department? Are they following his lead?" "Not everyone," Teresa replied. "Some of the younger officers are still with us, but there's a middle group, officers who are undecided. They're watching to see who comes out on top." Karen's jaw tightened. She knew this fight wasn't just about Jeff and his loyalists. It was about the undecided officers, the ones who could tip the balance of power in either direction. If she lost their support, Jeff would win by default. "Where is he now?" Karen asked. "In the squad room," Teresa said. "He's holding court with his usual crew." Karen stood, smoothing her uniform with deliberate precision. "It's time we had a conversation." The squad room fell silent the moment Karen walked in. Officers who had been chatting at their desks quickly busied themselves with paperwork. Jeff Parker stood near the coffee machine, flanked by 3 of his closest allies. His arms were crossed, and his expression was smug, as if he'd been waiting for Karen to show up. "Sergeant Parker," Karen said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "A word." Jeff didn't move at first, his posture deliberately defiant. Then, with exaggerated slowness, he stepped forward. The other officers watched with a mix of curiosity and unease, their gazes flickering between Karen and Jeff like spectators at a boxing match. "Yes, Chief," Jeff said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "How can I help you?" Karen held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Let's talk in my office." Jeff's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Lead the way." As they walked down the hallway, the tension between them crackled like a live wire. Once inside Karen's office, she closed the door and motioned for Jeff to sit. He hesitated for a moment, then dropped into the chair opposite her desk, his body language casual but calculated. Karen remained standing, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her desk. She didn't speak right away, letting the silence stretch out until Jeff shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Let's cut to the chase," Karen said finally. "I know what you're doing." Jeff raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I'm not sure what you mean." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't insult my intelligence, Jeff. You're undermining my authority, rallying officers to resist the changes I'm implementing, and now you've escalated to outright defiance. If you have something to say it to my face." Jeff leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Fine. Do you want to hear it? I think you're taking this department in the wrong direction. You're so focused on appeasing the community that you're forgetting what we're here to do: protect and serve." Karen's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "Protect and serve? Is that what you call profiling, harassment, and abuse of power? Because that's what this department has been doing for years, and it's why we're in this mess." Jeff's expression hardened. "You think you know this department, but you don't. You've been here, what, a month? I've been here for over 2 decades. I've seen what works and what doesn't. And this new direction you're pushing, it's not going to work." Karen took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "You're right about one thing. I haven't been here as long as you. But that's exactly why I see what you can't. You've spent so long defending the old ways that you're blind to how broken they are." Jeff's jaw clenched, the muscles in his face twitching. "So what? You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything overnight?" "No," Karen said sharply. "I don't expect overnight change, but I do expect progress. And if you're not willing to be part of the solution, then you're part of the problem." The room fell silent, the weight of Karen's words pressing down on both of them. Jeff stared at her, his defiance flickering like a flame struggling against a strong wind. "You're making a mistake," Jeff said finally, his voice low. "These officers won't follow you if you alienate them." Karen leaned forward, her voice cold and steady. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest, Jeff. I'm here to lead. And if some officers can't handle that, they're free to leave." Jeff stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over." Karen stepped aside, motioning toward the door. "No, it's not. But make no mistake, I'm not going anywhere. The question is, can you say the same?" Jeff didn't respond. He stormed out of the office, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Karen watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew Jeff wasn't finished, but neither was she. That evening, Karen sat alone in her office, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The confrontation with Jeff had been draining but necessary. She had drawn another line in the sand, and this time there was no mistaking her resolve. Karen picked up the note Ramirez had given her the day before and read it again. "Traitors don't belong here. Watch your back." The words didn't scare her. They fueled her. Whoever had written this didn't understand who they were dealing with. Karen placed the note back in her drawer and closed it with a decisive click. The road ahead was uncertain, and the battle with Jeff and his loyalists was far from over. But Karen had no intention of backing down. This was her precinct, her community, and her mission, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. The morning after her confrontation with Jeff Parker, Karen Blackwood stepped into her office feeling more resolved than ever. The tension within the department was palpable, but it didn't deter her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. Change wasn't supposed to be easy, and she hadn't signed up for this job expecting comfort. Karen glanced at the agenda on her desk. Today marked the start of the mandatory bias training she had instituted across the precinct. Every officer, from rookies to veterans, was required to attend. There were no exceptions. The goal was clear: to address the systemic issues that had plagued the department for years and begin the process of rebuilding trust with the community. The training sessions were scheduled to take place in the precinct's largest conference room. Karen made it a point to attend the first session, not as a spectator, but as a participant. She wanted her officers to see that this wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a commitment. As Karen entered the room, she was met with a mix of reactions. Some officers nodded respectfully, their expressions neutral but curious. Others avoided her gaze, their discomfort clear. And then there were those, like Jeff Parker and his closest allies, who wore their defiance openly. The trainer, a well-respected expert in implicit bias and community relations, began by outlining the goals of the session. Karen took a seat near the front, her presence commanding the room. "Let's start with an exercise," the trainer said, handing out sheets of paper. "I want each of you to write down the first 3 words that come to mind when you hear the word police." The room was silent as officers scribbled down their answers. When the trainer asked for volunteers to share, a few officers hesitated before speaking. "Authority," one said. "Protection," offered another. Jeff Parker, leaning back in his chair with an air of indifference, finally spoke. "Control." Karen didn't react, but she made a mental note of the word, control. It was telling, revealing exactly how Jeff viewed his role. The trainer nodded thoughtfully, then turned the question around. "Now think about how the community might answer this question. What 3 words do you think they would write?" A ripple of unease spread through the room. The answers came slower this time. "Mistrust," someone murmured. "Fear," another admitted. Karen glanced around the room, noting the expressions of discomfort on some faces and outright denial on others. This was the problem laid bare for all to see. The gulf between how the police saw themselves and how the community perceived them was vast. Bridging that gap would require more than training. It would require a fundamental shift in mindset. After the session ended, Karen lingered behind, speaking with a few of the younger officers who had approached her. They expressed cautious optimism, thanking her for taking the initiative to address the issues head-on. But as Karen left the room, she couldn't help but notice Jeff Parker standing in the hallway with a small group of officers. Their conversation stopped abruptly as she approached, and Jeff's expression hardened. "Something on your mind, Sergeant?" Karen asked, her tone calm but firm. Jeff shrugged. "Just seems like a waste of time, Chief. A bunch of buzzwords and feel-good exercises aren't going to fix this department." Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "What's a waste of time? Jeff is trying to hold this department back. You might not see the value in this training, but the community we serve does. And I'm here to serve them, not your outdated notions of policing." Jeff didn't respond, but Karen could see the anger simmering behind his eyes. She didn't wait for a reply. Turning on her heel, she walked away, her confidence unshaken. While the training sessions continued, Karen turned her attention to another critical reform: the establishment of the Community Oversight Board. For years, the department had faced accusations of misconduct, but investigations were often handled internally, with little transparency or accountability. Karen was determined to change that. The Oversight Board, made up of local residents, would have real authority to review complaints, recommend disciplinary actions, and work directly with Karen to address patterns of misconduct. Karen had carefully selected members who represented a cross-section of the community: activists, educators, faith leaders, and even former law enforcement officers who understood the complexities of the job. During the board's first meeting, Karen laid out her vision. "This board isn't just a formality," she said. "It's a partnership. You're not here to rubber stamp decisions or sit in on meetings. You're here to hold us accountable and to ensure that this department operates with the transparency and integrity our community deserves." The board members nodded their expressions, a mix of determination and cautious hope. Alicia Roberts, seated at the end of the table, raised her hand. "Chief, we appreciate your commitment, but we've seen oversight boards before. They're often toothless, more about optics than real change. How can we be sure this one will be different?" Karen met Alicia's gaze, her voice steady. "Because I'm giving you the tools to make it different. You'll have access to case files, the authority to make binding recommendations, and direct communication with me. This isn't about optics, it's about trust, and I know trust has to be earned." Alicia studied Karen for a moment, then nodded. "We'll hold you to that, Chief." As the Oversight Board began its work, Karen also focused on rebuilding trust through outreach. She organized community forums, inviting residents to share their concerns and ideas for improvement. At one such forum, held in a local school gymnasium, the turnout was larger than expected. Parents, students, business owners, and activists filled the room, their faces a mix of frustration and curiosity. Karen stood at the front, fielding questions and addressing concerns with honesty and empathy. "What about the officers who keep harassing our kids?" one parent demanded. "Are they going to face consequences, or are you just going to sweep it under the rug like always?" Karen's response was firm. "Every officer who violates department policy or abuses their authority will be held accountable. That's not a promise, it's a fact. We've already begun investigating complaints, and those responsible will face consequences." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were skeptical, but others were nodding in approval. By the end of the forum, Karen felt a glimmer of hope. The path forward was still uncertain, but the conversations she was having with both the community and her officers were a step in the right direction. Back at the precinct, Karen reviewed the day's progress. The bias training sessions were ongoing, the oversight board was taking shape, and the community was beginning to engage with her vision. But Karen knew the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead. As she prepared to leave for the night, Karen glanced at the stack of complaints on her desk. Each one represented a story, a person, a moment of pain or frustration that demanded justice. Karen placed her hand on the pile and exhaled deeply. The work was exhausting, but it was worth it. Change wasn't just coming, it was happening. The morning began with a phone call. Karen Blackwood was sitting at her desk, reviewing notes from the latest bias training sessions, when her phone buzzed sharply. It was Teresa Martinez. From the tension in her voice, Karen immediately knew something was wrong. "Chief, we've got a situation," Teresa said quickly. "There's a protest forming outside the East Side precinct." Karen's brow furrowed. "What's the issue?" Teresa hesitated, then said, "It's about the recent arrests in the neighborhood. The community's saying it's more of the same, profiling young black men. They're demanding answers." Karen leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. While she'd been working tirelessly to introduce reforms, the community's pain and distrust ran deep. Every incident, no matter how minor it might seem internally, was a reminder of the past wounds that had never healed. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Karen said firmly. When Karen arrived at the East Side precinct, the scene was already chaotic. A crowd of about 70 people had gathered, holding signs that read, "Stop the profiling," and "Justice for our kids." Their chants echoed through the narrow streets, a mixture of anger and determination. Police vehicles had been positioned to create a makeshift barricade between the crowd and the precinct. A line of officers stood in front of the building, their faces tense as they watched the protesters. Karen scanned the scene, noting the visible agitation on both sides. Sergeant Jeff Parker was near the barricade, barking orders to the officers around him. Karen approached him, her presence immediately drawing attention. Jeff turned to her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disdain. "Chief," he said curtly, "we've got it under control." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Under control? You mean escalating tensions with a show of force?" Jeff's jaw tightened. "These people are making baseless accusations. We can't just let them." Karen cut him off. "What we can't do is make this worse. Step back, Sergeant. I'll handle it from here." Jeff hesitated, clearly reluctant to relinquish control, but Karen's tone left no room for argument. He stepped aside, his frustration evident. Karen turned her attention to the crowd, stepping past the barricade. The chants softened as the protesters noticed her. Among them, she spotted a familiar face, Alicia Roberts. "Alicia," Karen called out, raising her hand in a gesture of peace. "Can we talk?" The crowd parted slightly as Alicia stepped forward, her expression a mix of anger and determination. She crossed her arms, her sharp gaze fixed on Karen. "What's there to talk about, Chief?" Alicia said, her voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Another young man was arrested last night for nothing more than walking home. This isn't reform, it's the same old story." Karen held her ground, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to listen, Alicia, and I'm here to address your concerns. But I can't do that if we're shouting at each other across a barricade. Let's talk face to face." Alicia studied her for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you'd better come with real answers, not excuses." Karen and Alicia stepped aside, away from the noise of the crowd. A few other community leaders joined them, their expressions a mix of skepticism and hope. "Let's start with the arrests," Alicia said, her tone sharp. "You say you're about reform, but your officers are still out here profiling our kids. How do you explain that?" Karen took a deep breath. "I won't make excuses for what happened," she said honestly. "But I can promise you this. Every complaint of profiling is being investigated thoroughly, and if it's found that any officer violated policy, there will be consequences." "That's not enough," Malik, a young activist, interjected. "We've been hearing promises for years. What's actually changing?" Karen turned to him, her gaze steady. "Let me tell you what's changing. Mandatory bias training is already underway. The Community Oversight Board has been established, and it has the authority to hold officers accountable. I've also introduced new guidelines for stops and searches, requiring detailed documentation to ensure transparency." Mullet crossed his arms, still skeptical. "And how do we know you'll follow through? How do we know this isn't just more lip service?" Karen's voice hardened slightly. "Because I grew up in this community. I know what it feels like to be on the other side of this conversation. I've spent my entire career fighting to change the system from within, and I won't stop now, but I need you to work with me. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without trust." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Karen fielding questions and addressing concerns as best she could. By the end, the tension had eased slightly, though the skepticism remained. Alicia turned to the crowd and raised her hand, signaling for quiet. "All right, folks," Alicia said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "The chiefs agreed to meet with us again tomorrow to go over these issues in detail. For now, let's disperse peacefully." The crowd began to break apart, though the atmosphere remained heavy with unspoken frustration. Karen watched them go, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the moment. As Alicia approached her, she offered a small nod. "You handled yourself well today, Chief, but don't think for a second that the pressure's off. We're watching you." Karen nodded. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Back at the precinct, Karen debriefed with Teresa, who had watched the protest from a distance. "How'd it go?" Teresa asked. Karen sank into her chair, exhaustion creeping into her voice. "It went as well as it could. The community's angry, and they have every right to be, but I think we made some progress." Teresa nodded. "And Jeff?" Karen's expression darkened. "He's part of the problem, and he knows it. But I'll deal with him later. Right now, my focus is on keeping the lines of communication with the community open." That night, Karen sat at her desk replaying the day's events in her mind. The protest had been a reminder of just how fragile the relationship between the police and the communities still was. But it was also a reminder of why she'd taken this job in the first place. The road ahead would be long and filled with setbacks, but Karen was ready. She wasn't just fighting for her department, she was fighting for the people who had placed their trust in her, even when trust seemed impossible. And as long as she had that fight in her, she wasn't going anywhere. The protest had dispersed, but the echoes of its chants still reverberated in Karen Blackwood's mind. The following morning, as she sat at her desk overlooking the precinct, the weight of the previous day pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had won a small victory by engaging with the community, but she knew that maintaining their fragile trust would require far more than words. Karen's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lieutenant Teresa Martinez entered, her face serious but composed. She carried a file in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Morning, Chief," Teresa said, placing the file on Karen's desk. "I thought you'd want to see this." Karen opened the file to find detailed reports from the new Community Oversight Board. It included accounts from residents about incidents of alleged profiling, along with preliminary findings from the board's investigations. Karen scanned the pages, her expression tightening. "This is exactly why we need them," Karen said, her voice firm. "Without these reports, half of this would have stayed buried." Teresa nodded. "The board's already making waves, but it's also stirring up more resistance within the department. Jeff and his group aren't happy about having their actions scrutinized." Karen placed the file down, leaning back in her chair. "Good. If they're uncomfortable, it means we're doing something right." Later that morning, Karen called a department-wide meeting. The officers filed into the squad room, their expressions ranging from curious to outright hostile. At the front of the room stood Karen, her posture straight and commanding. "Good morning," she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I've called this meeting because it's time we had a serious conversation about where this department is headed." She let her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Yesterday's protest wasn't just about one incident. It was about years of mistrust, years of pain, and years of this department failing to live up to its promise to serve and protect. That failure stops now." Karen's gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Jeff Parker, who sat near the back with his arms crossed. "I know some of you aren't happy with the changes I've been implementing. I know some of you think the old ways were good enough. But let me be clear, those ways are over. We are here to serve this community, and if you're not willing to do that, you're free to leave." A murmur spread through the room, but Karen pressed on. "This isn't just about policies or training. It's about the kind of department we want to be. Do we want to be remembered as a force for justice or as a relic of a broken system? That's the choice we're making today." Karen turned to Teresa, who stepped forward to address the room. "Starting next week, we'll be expanding our community outreach efforts," Teresa announced. "This includes attending neighborhood meetings, collaborating with local organizations, and working with the oversight board to address concerns directly. These aren't optional assignments, they're part of our duty." Karen stepped forward again, her voice rising. "I understand that change is uncomfortable. I understand that it's easier to cling to what's familiar, even if it's flawed. But we don't have that luxury anymore. The community is watching us, they're counting on us, and I won't let them down." After the meeting, Karen returned to her office, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The resistance within the department was strong, but she could sense a shift. Some officers, particularly the younger ones, were beginning to see the value in her vision. Others remained staunchly opposed, their loyalty to Jeff Parker unwavering. Later that afternoon, Karen received an unexpected visitor. Alicia Roberts walked into her office, her expression unreadable. Karen gestured for her to sit, surprised by the unannounced visit. "What brings you here, Alicia?" Karen asked, leaning forward slightly. Alicia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to thank you for how you handled the protest yesterday. It wasn't perfect, but you showed up, and that means something." Karen allowed herself a small smile. "I appreciate that, but I know showing up is just the first step." Alicia nodded. "It is, and you're right, trust takes time. But I can see you're trying, and that matters. The community is still skeptical, but they're willing to give you a chance." Karen felt a flicker of relief. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance to prove we can do better." Alicia stood, her tone softening slightly. "Don't waste it, Chief. People are counting on you." That evening, as Karen prepared to leave for the day, Teresa appeared in her doorway, her expression unreadable. "We've got something," she said, holding up a folder. Karen took the folder and opened it to find the results of her quiet investigation into the anonymous threats. Inside were detailed reports linking the notes to a small group of officers, Jeff Parker's inner circle. "They're the ones behind the threats," Teresa said. "And Jeff's been protecting them." Karen's expression darkened. She had expected as much, but seeing it confirmed on paper was a bitter pill to swallow. "It's time to deal with this," she said, her voice firm. "No more waiting." The next morning, Karen called Jeff Parker into her office. He entered with his usual air of defiance, but there was an undercurrent of unease in his posture. "Sit down, Jeff," Karen said, her tone icy. Jeff sat, his arms crossed. "What's this about, Chief?" Karen slid the folder across the desk. "It's about this. Your inner circle has been making threats, undermining my leadership, and refusing to follow orders. And you've been enabling it." Jeff didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the contents of the folder. When he looked up, there was a flash of anger in his gaze. "You've got nothing on me." Karen leaned forward, her voice cold. "Don't test me, Jeff. I've been patient, but that patience has run out. You've got two choices. You can fall in line, or you can hand in your badge. Either way, this ends today." Jeff stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can run this department without me? Good luck." Karen didn't flinch. I don't need luck, Jeff. I need officers who are committed to doing what's right. If that's not you, there's the door." For a moment, Jeff stared at her, his fury barely contained. Then, without another word, he stormed out of the office. Karen watched him go, her resolve unshaken. As the day went on, Karen received word that several of Jeff's closest allies had submitted their resignations. The department was smaller now, but it was leaner and more focused. Karen felt a sense of relief, though she knew the battle wasn't over. She had won a significant victory. That evening, as Karen sat in her office, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead would still be challenging, but she could see the first signs of progress. The community was beginning to engage, the oversight board was gaining traction, and the department was slowly shedding the toxic elements that had held it back. Karen looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. Karen Blackwood wasn't going to stop until her precinct and her city was better for everyone. The story of Karen Blackwood is a powerful reminder of the challenges and triumphs that come with leadership, especially in the face of systemic resistance. Her journey as the first Black woman to lead a precinct fraught with tension is more than just a tale of professional ambition. It's a lesson in resilience, accountability, and the courage to stand for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Karen didn't just inherit a broken system. She stepped into a role knowing that change would be met with defiance from within and skepticism from the community she served. Her ability to bridge that divide by holding her officers accountable while working tirelessly to rebuild trust with the public is a testament to her unwavering determination. It's a reminder that true reform isn't about quick fixes, but about consistent, deliberate actions that prioritize integrity over convenience. The key takeaway here is the importance of leadership that listens, acts, and adapts. Karen's story shows that trust is built in moments of vulnerability, and progress is achieved by confronting uncomfortable truths rather than avoiding them. Whether you're in law enforcement, a community leader, or just navigating your personal challenges, Karen's journey encourages us all to face resistance with strength and to use every setback as an opportunity for growth. Go back. If this story inspired you, let us know. If you thought it was good, comment 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment 2. We'd also love to hear about your own experiences, whether they involve leadership, resilience, or standing up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. We can't wait to hear from you.